Today we're going to be talking about density. Density is how tightly packed the particles are in a piece of matter. Okay, so this piece of matter at the top is less dense than the piece of matter at the bottom. The piece of matter at the bottom, the particles in it are tightly packed together. That means that it's more dense. Now, the density of an object depends on its mass, the amount of matter it contains, and its volume, the amount of space it takes up. So, this block of wood and the sponge have the same volume. That means they take up the same amount of space. They're the same size. But the block of wood has a much greater mass, so it is more dense than the sponge. Okay, so if we put the block of wood on a triple beam balance, it's going to have a lot more mass than the sponge would, because the block of wood, its particles are packed together a lot tighter than that of the sponge. The sponge has a lot of space in it, like air in it. Okay, different objects and substances have different densities. So, a rock is going to have a lot more density. It's going to be a lot more dense than the squishy ball here. Density is a physical property of matter. When you investigate whether something floats or sinks in water, you're investigating its density in relation to the density of the water. What we're going to call that this year is relative density. If something sinks or floats, we're finding out its relative density. We can float on water because our bodies are less dense than the water. So water is more dense than our bodies. That's why we can float. A rock sinks in a pond because the rock is more dense than the water, so it sinks. Okay, we see two liquids here. We see oil and we see water. Now, the oil floats to the top of the water because the oil is less dense than the water. So there we have oil, there we have water. Now, doesn't even matter if we put the oil in and mix it up. The oil's just kind of flying around everywhere in the water. But after a little while, if you let it set, the oil always floats back up to the top because it's less dense. Okay, now there are three liquids here. We have oil, water, and honey. So we already said that oil is less dense than water. Okay, and honey is more dense than water. So the honey sinks to the bottom and the oil floats on top of the water. So the honey is more dense than water. The oil is less dense than water. So, why does this block of wood float in the beaker with the water? You guessed it. It's because it's less dense than the water. Now, if you look at the molecules here, at the particles are packed together more in the water than they are in the wood. So the wood is going to float because it's less dense. Okay, compare these two objects. What will happen if they're thrown into a pond and why? Okay, so the stone will sink because it is more dense. The football will float because it is less dense than the water. Now, oil floats to the top of the water because, oil is more dense than water. Okay, doesn't sound like what we were just talking about. Okay, water is more dense than oil. Sounds pretty good. Okay, C, water has density and oil does not. That's just goofy. So remember, we get rid of the goofy answers. Okay, oil has density and water does not. That's also a goofy answer. So C and D, we know straight off it's not that. And we talked about the fact that oil is less dense than water a minute ago. So we know that it's going to have to be B. Water is more dense than oil. Okay, so that was density. Thanks.